It's an enormous pleasure and honor to be here. I think this is the first time in our lives together, which are for fairly substantial length. We won't discuss how long it has been. This is the first time we've lectured together, or one after the other, and you will see in the process one of the, I think, the basis of our marriage, which is that we do things very differently. So Alison is precise, focused, and entirely reasonable, and I go for really big issues and make very wild conjectures. But the difference is, of course, Alison is like you, a respectable academic, and I'm neither respectable nor an academic. I decided a very long time ago, really a long time ago, that the one thing I didn't want to be was an academic, and it's one of the few decisions I have never regretted, and I've stuck with it all my life. I never planned to be a journalist. It came by accident in my early 40s. My life was has been full of surprises, and one of them is that I became a journalist, but it turned out to fit my particular character very well. It allows me to write about just about anything. I'm not expected to meet the highest standards in my writing about any topic because I'm a journalist, but which gives me immense freedom, and it allows me to write about and have opinions about more subjects than any other decent economist, with the possible exception of Joe Stiglitz, would ever dare. And I don't need to meet his intellectual standards. So for me, it's been utterly wonderful. I do, however, recognize your generosity in inviting me here, and I presume that's because it would allow you to invite a respectable academic, namely my wife. So this is not an academic presentation. My focus is I tend to write about things and talk about things that I think are important. And whether we can make definitive conclusions matters to me less than the importance of the subject. So essentially what I'm talking about is our political and economic systems today, where they are, and what that might imply for our future. I'm much better at discussing how we got into the mess we are in than I am in giving you answers on how we're going to get out of it, because I don't know how we're going to get out of it. And I worry very much usually when I hear people who tell me that they do know how we're going to get out of it. We have one of them on one side of our politics in the election today in Britain. But I think I have some idea of the dilemmas and some of the things we have to do. My core idea is that we have evolved, not by accident, a political and economic system in our world, the world of the high-income advanced democracies, which somehow tries to balance two systems which have, as I will argue, some important relationships and some important tensions between them to govern our political and economic life. I've used provocatively capitalism, though I tend to think of it more as broadly defined, a market-led economic system. And, of course, democracy, as we conduct it, and one of the questions which I won't explore, but you should explore, is whether we should conduct democracy in an entirely different way. I think that's one of the questions. But anyway, we have settled on, over the after the war, but it's evolved, on a synthesis of political systems which are democratic, that is to say national, rooted in states, most of which, though not all, are nation states, local, which involve the concept of citizenship, and an economic system, a market system, which has become, to some extent by design, and to some extent actually by accident, global, involving individuals in very different relationships from their political relationships. And my fundamental argument is this has clearly now triggered a crisis. It's obvious it's triggered a crisis, and I'm going to explain how we got there, and then we can think about, perhaps later, towards the end, about what you might think about doing it. I'm writing a whole book on this, and I'm really only discussing largely the analysis of how we got here and what might lie ahead, but what might lie ahead is a relatively small part. So let me start then with an interesting and important framing quote. May I ask, by the way, would anyone here who has a degree or postgraduate degree in economics please put up their hand? Okay, you are a minority. This is good. That means everybody else here can actually think about economics. I have come to the view in my life that studying economics is incredibly destructive. It's taken me 50 years, literally, to liberate myself from almost everything I was taught. Now, it helps that I don't have to teach it. Now, so let me start with what I think is an interesting way of framing the issue. It's not the only way, but it frames it nicely. It's from a very interesting and important economist, Danny Roderick, who is of Turkish origin, has taught in Harvard for many, many years, briefly went to the Princeton Institute of Advanced Studies and found it so unbearably boring he went back to Harvard. I'm sure that your experience here will be quite different. He wrote about a certain sort of trilemma, what economists call a trilemma. It's that democracy, national sovereignty, and global economic integration are mutually incompatible. We can have any two of the three, but never have all three simultaneously and in full. In other words, there are fundamental trade-offs to be made. If you want full democracy and full national sovereignty, you have to be an autocracy. You have to, you have to be self-sufficient, fully self-sufficient. Obviously, you can't be fully self-sufficient, and in the process of not being fully self-sufficient, you lose sovereignty, and in the process of losing sovereignty, you probably at least moderate your democracy. And if anybody here doesn't understand what that means, please think about what it means to be in the Eurozone, because it's pretty obvious. If you share a monetary policy, you can't have all these three things. Ask the Italians. So that's what he's saying. And it's a good opening to our discussion. So this is what I want to cover. There are 6 areas. Most of it will be on the third, the breakdown of trust. I said I want to talk about what's happened in the relationship. I'm going to start by talking a bit about the relationship between democracy and capitalism, basically articulating a little bit more this synergy and tension idea, which I started with. Then I'm going to talk about this extraordinary explosion of the last 4 decades in our move to a global capitalism and what that means in some respects. Then I'm going to talk about the series of developments that broke down the fundamental trust, the bonds of trust on which a democracy depends. If it's a system based on the idea of citizenship, citizens have to believe the system broadly defined works for them, which means, following Allison, that elites are interested in them. If they conclude that elites are not interested in them, and they have almost everywhere, you have a problem. Then I'm going to talk about some really rather bad ideas that emerge as a result, but naturally, inevitably. And then I'll talk briefly about what might lie ahead before a very brief summary on challenges. So let me start with democracy and capitalism. And in writing this book, I sort of, because as somebody pointed out, before I sank to being an economist, I started off for many years of my life as a classicist. So I spent about 5 years of my life doing nothing but read Latin and Greek. And looking back on it, it's actually the most important thing I did personally, intellectually. And I included about half my time at Oxford before I sunk to doing politics, philosophy, and economics, and then a graduate degree in economics. So in thinking about democracy, I went back to the classics, above all Plato and Aristotle. They'd experienced democracy, a very special sort of democracy. I won't go into all the defects, but it was for a limited part of the population, obviously male citizens, pretty vigorous democracy. And Aristotle in his Politics, which was based on, Aristotle, I hadn't realized this, the first true social scientist, as he was the first through almost everything except Plato. In my view, the greatest intellectuals ever lived. Sent apparently lots of his students around Greece to write down a report on the constitutions of every city-state in Greece, and there were lots of them, so you could compare them. And his politics is based on an analysis of this. It contains some very peculiar sections. For instance, his views on slavery are, to put it mildly, weird. But there's one paragraph section which is really important because it's core. And basically what he's saying is the best partnership in a state is the one which operates through the middle people. What he's saying is a stable democratic constitution, that is to say, a constitutional state, which he calls a politeia, in which all citizens involved require a really strong middle class. That's what this says. It just seems to me amazing. I didn't know, if I'd forgotten or didn't know this, that somebody could have realized that 2,400 years ago. And it remains as central, in my view, to understanding where democracies work and how they work today as it ever has been. It is the core insight, in my view. Now, before I explain this, let me just say a little bit about my view about the market economy, capitalism, and democracy. I think there is a certain degree of very clear and essential support. If you have a vigorous, powerful democracy built on citizenship as an ideal, the state, guided by democracy, reacts against, and has repeatedly reacted against, lots of literature on this, excessively predatory forms of the market economy, what you might broadly describe as plutocracy, which is the ever-abiding threat of a market system, that it ends up as plutocratic. One of the most important episodes in that reaction was the late 19th and early 20th century in America, the antitrust movement, which Teddy Roosevelt put through, the beginning of antitrust. And by the way, that idea was also central in the social market economy theorizing of the German liberals in the pre-Bundesrepublik discussions of what a state, this is why competition policy was a central element in the constitution of the European Economic Community and remains so today. And at the same time, the existence of property rights, that there are some property rights which allow people to trade on their own behalf in corporations and as individuals, is a way of preventing the emergence of a fully unbridled demagogic state. That's the counterpart. So there is an obvious, I don't know why I got to this, because this shouldn't be here, but I'll come back. I'm obviously pressing on it by mistake. I apologize. So I'll come to that in a moment. There's an obvious support, but there's also obviously real tension. If the society becomes too unequal, you would emerge a hugely prosperous oligarchy at the top of a society with controlling most of the resources in a society, and that's what Marx wrote about. You end up with a plutocracy. You see that all over Latin America. You see it in Russia today, and I think we're in real threat of that in our own societies, most obviously today in America. And of course, on the other side, the reaction to that can take the extreme form of destruction of property rights, which can lead in the wrong hands, and I'm not saying it's necessary, but in the wrong hands, in something that looks like contemporary Venezuela. Both are very dangerous extremes. And of course, the Greeks believe very passionately, as do I, that you can never have simple solutions to these sorts of problems. You have to have a balance. It's about balancing the two, and good constitutions balance the two. Now, historically, fascinating, I'll come to this in a second, the emergence of market-led capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, which was a dynamic form of this system, brought forth universal suffrage democracy after 100 years of struggle, of course. That's what systems do, political struggle. Why did it do so? It brought forward rising wealth, and with it, liberation of many people from the simple task of subsisting day to day as the only task of life. It brought the beginning of rising education levels. What Alison talked about for universities is exactly what you would have said about schools up to the secondary level in the 19th century. That's a complete transformation. By the end of the 19th century, in most European countries, we had basic literacy in the population. It was a very big change in most societies, not in all. Rising urbanization, rising unionization, rising demands on the population, above all mass conscription, and in response to all this, the principle, if you like, of no taxation without representation. The people said, well, you've changed us. We can read, we can think, we're mobilized in factories. You want us to fight for you. We want a voice in politics. And dealing with that was a principal problem of politics from 1860 onwards. You could say much earlier in France, because France always got there first with the revolution, but think about what Bismarck was about. Bismarck was about preventing this. That's why he did the welfare. Well, I won't go into all this history, but that was the dominant theme. And I think these systems have something else in common, which is a core idea, despite all the tension, which is the idea we have societies without inherited status. The underlying idea of a market system, any market system, is anybody should in principle be able to enter, start a business, succeed or fail, require skills which will have value. It's a system based on the idea, an ideal, of individual talent and merit, regardless of status, and today, increasingly regardless of gender. And democracy, of course, is inherently based on the idea of no status other than that of citizenship, which, of course, raises immediately colossal questions as soon as you get to mass immigration, but I'll come to that later. So there are strong synergies, but at the same time, there are strong tensions for a very simple reason. The market economy tends naturally to generate extreme inequality, and the political system, democracy, rests on the assumption of fundamental equality of political say through the vote. And that's a pretty extreme tension. Now, how does this work in history? Well, it's quite interesting, and this rather surprised me. So I am particularly interested in global capitalism and its fate. And one of the best indications of what's going on in the capitalist economy, the market economy, is, and certainly in the global economy, is how much trade there is across borders, how open the economy. So the blue line and then the orange line is a series which show the ratio of trade to world GDP. And the brown line shows the proportion of all the governments in the world that have elected governments. They're not perfect. I can go through the database. It's the best international database we have. And there's actually a reasonably close correlation between the two. We started off in the 1870s with almost no democracies. If you go into 1800, there are none. Because it assumes that the great majority of the citizenry, or at least most of them, a very big proportion of them can vote. Of course, female suffrage only starts in the 1890s, and most of it is after the First World War. But essentially, there are no democracies. Up to there was a pretty large expansion in world trade in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. It rose from about 23% to 30% of world trade. There was a period of rapidly rising prosperity, but huge inequality, and the proportion of democracies in the world rose very rapidly. There's a problem with this data, which I can't explore in full, which is obvious, which is a lot of countries were in empires then, so the number of countries has exploded over time. Then we got the 20s and 30s, and the 20s and 30s were economic catastrophes above all the 30s, and they were also a catastrophe for politics. And by the 1930s, the proportion of democracies in the world was smaller than it had been 50 years earlier. Again, stress that the empire doesn't change much, then the empire survived. Then after the war, trade rebounded. We've had the biggest period of globalization in world history. I'll come to that in a moment. And in the last 50 years, coinciding with that immense opening of economies, we also had an immense expansion in the proportion of the governments of the world that are democratic. And I argue, but I don't have time to go into detail, that there's a reason there's this relationship in terms of the optimism of society, in terms of the role of prosperity in encouraging more open political systems, and periods of prosperity tend to coincide with these periods of greater openness as both cause and consequence. Now, let me move to the next. That's all I have to say about democracy, the market economy, or capitalism, the way they relate to it. Now let me look at the last 40 years, what's happened in this last period, which started off with this very encouraging, from my point of view, movement towards openness and democracy, and has ended rather bitterly. And here's a view, and I'll give a counterpart view later on, from Xi Jinping, and I think this is actually, in some sense, though put in our language, what he believes. For us, the Chinese, he says, this globalization period, this period of rampant opening of economies under market pressures, has powered global growth, facilitated movement of goods and capital, advances in science, technology, and civilization, and interactions among peoples. Now, how far he believed in all that, I have no idea, but it's what his advisors wanted him to say, and lots of Chinese believe this. There's no doubt, I meet lots of them, and they believe this. This has been absolutely great, of course, as long as it doesn't bring them democracy. We'll come to that at the end. And from their point of view, it's pretty clear it has done so. So I just want to bring out one aspect, two aspects of this story of the last 40 or 50 years, which is the background, I think, helpful background to the discussion of the last few decades in our countries. So here I'm just comparing 2000 with 2018. And it's one crucial aspect, it seems to me, of what we have experienced, the framework of it. So on the left, I show in 2000 the share of the world economy of us, the Western system, which is, I've defined for this purpose as the US and its advanced country allies, who are not, of course, all Western. So the bottom blue block is the US itself. The next block above it is the European Union. Above that is other NATO members, and the green is the main Asia-Pacific allies of the United States, obvious countries in the list, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea. The key point is that even as recently as 2000, and these are numbers at purchasing power parity, which actually reduce the weight of the developed world compared with market prices. But even at purchasing power parity, which I think is the best relative measure, nearly 60% of world output was still generated by the Western economies as recently as 2000. They were overwhelmingly powerful. This position of overwhelming power in the world, the Western market-led democracies, including here, as I said, the Asian giants, the big Asian countries, had been dominant like this for the previous 130 years. Actually 150. Well, it gets a bit difficult if we think about the 19th century, but they had been the power center of the world. And on the right, I put China and its most obvious ally, Russia. And China was really quite insignificant. You can see, economically insignificant, power potential insignificant. And on the right now, I've got 2018. So this is just 18 years. And over that period, the Western countries' role in the world has gone from 60 to 40%, and China basically has gone from 4% to nearly 20%. So the first thing to understand, and I think it's very important in understanding particularly what's going on in the US, it's not the only thing, but it's important, is there has genuinely been in this period, very recently, a gigantic shift in global economic power. And if there's one thing we know in the modern world, is that all other forms of power are based on economic power. They've consistently been based on economic power. So that's the first thing I wanted to show. I'm going to only show two things about this global period, but it's the framework for what I'm going to talk about. And the second thing I want to talk about is the impact on the distribution of income globally. What's happened? There are many ways I could show this, but this is not about countries. And here I've used an updated version of a chart which is very famous among economists now by a friend of mine, Branko Milanovic, who used to work at the World Bank, and it's called the elephant curve. It looks less like an elephant now than it used to because the data have been updated. It used to look something like this, and then there was this huge tail at the end, and I'll come to the tail in a moment. Because I think in a way this encapsulates what's happened to the world and why we have so many miserable people in our countries. So if you look at the bottom 40th percentiles, this is the percentile of the global distribution of income. It's a construct of the global income distribution of income, or more precisely, it's change, increase in household incomes, equivalized, I won't go into that, in real terms from the World Inequality Database, which is, by the way, put together by French economists, so it must be right. People associated with Thomas Piketty basically put this together. Emmanuel Saez, Gabriel Zuckman, and so forth. So basically what it shows is that between the 20th and the 40th decile, real incomes over this period increased by about 130%, which is a very substantial increase from very low levels. And then as you go down towards the 60th, 70th, and 80th, the increases were something like 30 or 40%. That's a pretty massive difference. Who are these people? Well, the people at the bottom there is basically East and South Asia, above all China. So sort of getting to half the population, that's roughly Asia. And the rest is everybody else. The former Soviet Union, Eastern Central Europe, us, Western Europe, North America, South America. And you can see that if you go through the 60th, 70th, 80th, and 90th percentiles, their real income increases have been very modest. So this has been a really remarkable period for some countries in Asia, which is half of humanity, by the way. India would not be so far behind China. It's behind. But and then you get, and this is where this thing, you get the 90th percentile up to the 99th. You can see they're doing much better. And then all the rest up there is the global 1%. The global 1% is not the same as our 1%. You are now, or you soon will be, all of you in the global 1%. I'm quite sure. Global 1% is very much larger than our 1%. But the essential point is they made out bandits. That's what's happened into global income distribution in the last 35 years, as far as we know, whose winners were and who the losers are. Now let me go to my third section, which is, having given this context sort of philosophically and historically in a very, very rough way, what happened to us more precisely. By us, I mean advanced high-income democracies, which were considered to have the most stable, most rooted democratic systems in the world. And I've got this lovely quote I've come to think is very helpful from Ernest Hemingway, The Sun Always Rises, in which somebody asks, somebody called Mike actually, how did you go bankrupt? And he answered, as probably any bankrupt would answer, well, there were two ways, gradually and then suddenly. And that's how most people do go bankrupt. You go bankrupt slowly until, bang, one day. I think of the Thomas Cook Company in Britain, which has been existing for 170 years, just failed, and nobody thought it would go bankrupt until one week, one day, it disappeared. And I think that's what's happened to us. And I will explain why I think that. It's not what I thought at the time, which is rather shameful, but there we are. So here's a chart. Well, before I get to this one, let me just give you some data which are relevant to why I'm legitimately concerned. So Freedom House, which is a US think tank, produces, I think, a superb annual report on the state of democracy in the world. In its latest annual report has said as follows: democracy is in crisis. The values it embodies, particularly the right to choose leaders and free and fair elections, freedom of the press and the rule of law, are under assault and in retreat globally, including in the West, and quite specifically, including the US. Political rights and civil liberties around the world deteriorated to their lowest point in more than a decade in 2017, extending a period characterized by emboldened autocrats, beleaguered democracies, and the United States' withdrawal from any leadership role in these struggles. And according to Roberto Foa and Yasha Monk, two very well-known political scientists, in a report which was really very shocking, published in 2016, I quote, "Over the last 3 decades, trust in political institutions such as parliaments or the courts has precipitously declined across the established democracies of North America and Western Europe." And in my book, I cite many of the charts that support this shocking fact. In fact, it seems to have declined generation by generation, with the current younger generation more cynical about our institutions by far than previous generations. Trust has been lost in both the democratic, political, and capitalist or market economic systems, and that has resulted in what we call, and I'll come in later in a bit more detail on what I think this means, populism, quote unquote. There is a big debate about whether such populism has economic or cultural roots, but my view is that it's very clear that it has both. The breakdown of trust reflects declining status and thwarted aspirations, among other things, in large parts of our societies. In addition, absolute rises in prosperity have slowed dramatically, and important groups have suffered long-term declines in relative and sometimes absolute economic positions, particularly, this is where it fits beautifully with Alison's thesis, those without a college degree, particularly men, and those living in provincial towns. My impression, though I may be very wrong in this, so this is just an impression, that the Gilets jaunes have something to do with this. Now, and it's why, of course, lots of people want to go to university, because those without don't do very well. And then, of course, came an absolutely crucial event, the financial crisis. And I'm going to stress this because I think it was a decisive moment, and it shows why economics matters. And I will show you that it was politically decisive in the countries it most adversely affected. Financial crises are politically brutal events. They are visible. They have immediate and obvious consequences, all bad. They reflect an obvious policy failure and a broader elite failure, and they create unavoidably and grievously unjust results because everybody saves the people who caused the crisis. And this has huge political outcomes. And one of the things we've actually discovered, as usual, economists get there after the train crash has happened, but since the crisis, there's been some wonderful work by some very, very good economic historians, which have basically brought out the fact that every time there's a really big financial crisis, politics goes to hell. So we shouldn't have been surprised. I wasn't very surprised when it happened that this was the consequence, because I was so well aware of what happened in the 30s. So let me now just put the context, the background data that supports some of the points I've made just now. So this is another way of looking at the data Alison already presented, and perhaps it's another even starker. So what I've got is the decadal average growth of output per hour, and output per hour is the basic unit of productivity growth, and the major determinant, therefore, of how quickly society as a whole gets richer. And if you've got zero growth of output per hour and your population is aging, so your labor force is growing less fast than the population, which is true of nearly all developed countries. France actually is something of an exception. Then you have a really big problem in growing GDP per head. So what it shows you from across the group of 7 countries plus Spain, I put Spain in as well, and I've ranked them across by their output per hour growth in the 2010s, which is actually 2010 to 2018 inclusive. And it basically brings out 3 fundamental points. One, as Alison said, we did much better as economies. I'm not saying this is cause and effect, but we did much better before we sent everybody to university. The 50s and 60s were everywhere terrific in terms of absolute growth in output per hour, and this allowed enormous increases in productivity. I won't go into the question of whether any of this is sustainable and climate, all this, that's another story. This was true across the board. It was least true in the US and UK, and there was a vast literature, by the way, in the 60s when I started studying economics on why the US and the UK were so sick, and why Japan and Germany were obviously the economies everybody should follow. And Japan is quite extraordinary, you will agree. And then it got very bad after the 70s, but still reasonably good in the 80s, particularly, and the 90s for quite a number of the economies. And then we hit the 2000s. A few did well, mainly the US, in the internet age, and the post-crisis era, which was absolutely grim. Basically, output per hour growth in our economies pretty well stopped for a very long period. In Britain, where it's now down to just above 0, about 0.2%, this is, so far as we can measure, the slowest growth in output per hour, and this is very difficult to measure, obviously, since the Napoleonic Wars, but certainly since 1900. This is an unprecedented stagnation. I don't have time to go into why this happened, but it's the background for the real income stagnation pretty well everywhere. Second thing I wanted to say is that almost everywhere, inequality has been rising. There are many ways of measuring inequality, but the one I've happened to use, because I don't have enough time to go through the other 10 that I have in my book, is the share of income accruing to the top 10% of the income distribution. And this is actually ranked here, the countries here are ranked by the increase in that share since 1981. So the largest increase is the US and UK. Spain is a relatively small increase, but admittedly from very high levels. France was one of the more unequal countries in the world in these countries in 1981, and its increase has been very modest. Germany actually has had a surprisingly large increase in inequality, which actually has been increasingly noted in Germany. But when I look at this, I say to myself, well, the US and UK seem to have a real problem with sustaining the legitimacy of their democracy. Well, maybe this is part of the reason. In fact, it's pretty obviously, in my view, part of the reason. The next chart I want to put up is about one big structural process, which I think is very important in explaining the disenchantment of a very sizable part of our population, and you ought to recognize it. And I didn't think there was anything we could do about it, but we didn't think about it. And that's mass deindustrialization. Back in 1970, in most industrialized economies, high-income economies, roughly 40% of all the labor force was employed in industry. In Germany, it was 50. In the UK, it was 45. This is broader than manufacturing. It includes some other sectors. Electricity generation, I think, is in this. These jobs were, this is just a fact, overwhelmingly male. They paid well. They were in organized factories, and they were the basis of the organized working class, which was a structural part of the post-war settlement in all Western societies. Strong unions, built-in industry, I think least strong in France, but very strong in Northern Europe, with generally high wages, and by then, remarkably, fairly secure employment in very low unemployment economies. And as you can see, there has been an enormous decline. In manufacturing, you'd basically take the same figures and knock off 10 percentage points, roughly. Germany, even Germany, which is very large industry because it has such a huge trade surplus in manufacturing, nonetheless, it's the same downward trend. A lot of these workers have been released into relatively casual, relatively poor jobs. By the way, perhaps to add to this, one of the most important sources of employment for these men now is construction and driving trucks. And driving trucks is seriously threatened by artificial intelligence. So just a footnote. But anyway, this is a very important long-term economic change. A completely different part of my story, again, I could give many other charts, is the absolutely outrageous behavior of our major corporations. So this is about tax avoidance. Just to give you illustrations of my points, I can't go through all of them. So this says, this is from the US data. The US data are always wonderful. They're very good at statistics. So this is from a friend of mine, Brad Setzer, who's at the Council on Foreign Relations, and I've used this this is from a chart from one of my columns. So this is about how tax avoidance works for major US corporations. By the way, it will be exactly the same for major European corporations. It's just we don't have the data. So this is about their foreign income and where they report their generating income. Okay? So since 1995 to 2019, the chart is divided between the red line, which are the biggest economies in the world. Germany, France, Italy, India, China, Japan. We don't have the UK data. That's where they really do business, of course, because those are the biggest economies in the world, outside America. We're talking about work. The blue line is where they report their profits from all the work, the business they do. And the blue line is the following giant economies: Luxembourg, Ireland, Netherlands, Switzerland, Singapore, Bermuda, and the Caribbean territories of the UK, which together are significantly smaller in population and GDP. Actually, together in population and GDP, they're probably half France. And this is the reported profits. And this is all legal. It's all the product of loopholes they have created and exploited. And it erodes tax revenue in the US radically. And you could show the same for all our other major countries. And we've not done anything about it. And why haven't we done anything about it? Because they're very, very powerful. This is the corrosive effects of plutocracy. I could have done many other things to illustrate this, but this is, I think, particularly stark. And I want to indicate one other structural change, which has, I think, unfortunately, but clearly in my mind, affected our politics and our ability to manage our politics, which is, but in very complicated and unpredictable ways. So between 2000 and 2016, what has happened to the proportion of the foreign-born in our populations? This obviously doesn't include the recent increase in immigration in Germany, the refugee crisis, because it goes to 2016. But what it shows is it's increased everywhere. It's clearly, I think, politically been a source of pressure. There's pretty obvious, powerful literature on that. But it is interesting to note that the correlation between the increase in the foreign-born share of the population and that political pressure is very, very weak. That is to say, some societies have coped with very large increases in the foreign-born in their populations. Ireland, Spain, for example, much better than countries like the US, which had very small increases in the foreign-born. So there is a lot here, even though it's clearly politically sensitive, which has to do with how societies cope with, adjust to, and see immigration. So those are a few of the really powerful longer-term trends that have occurred. But let me now go to two things which I think are particularly important about the crisis and its effects. So in this chart, what I've done, and I think it's the most striking I have, is ask the following question. How big has been the impact of the crisis on real output per head, which is the average in our countries? And the answer has been, it's dramatic and cumulative. So the lines are, these again, the same group of countries, so these are the major industrial high-income countries. The line up to 2007 shows deviations from the 1990 to 2007 trend line, and basically they all had slightly different trends, not wildly different except Italy, which had very low growth, and you can see there was no large fluctuations. The crisis hit, and very, very dramatic things happened. The least dramatic, and this might be very revealing when you look at it, was to Germany. Germany's GDP per head is pretty close to trend. It didn't have much of a shock. Japan was down 7 or 8%. It might be interesting because the politics of Japan too have remained rather stable. But when you go beyond those, you start seeing countries with absolutely enormous depression-level reductions in real GDP per head over 10 years with very little sign of recovery to trend, effectively none. So if you take Spain, the UK, or Italy, which are the worst, they all are about 25% below trend, which is an unprecedented reduction in GDP per head relative to trend over such a short period, and not the slightest sign of recovery to trend. In fact, they haven't even recovered to pre-crisis trend growth, let alone trend levels. And it isn't much better for Canada or the US. It's a bit better for France, but even for France, the country is still not, economy has not returned to its pre-crisis growth trend. This is an enormous shock, and once GDP per head falls so far below trend, indeed basically in many cases has stagnated, it's inevitable that the great proportion of the population, particularly if inequality is rising, will not experience real incomes per head. And here's the final chart on breakdown of trust, which discusses the political reaction. So Roberto Foa, whom I've mentioned, who now teaches at Cambridge, has put together, these are always questionable, essentially a dyad between populist parties of the right and left. Obviously, there's some question about how you define them, but in most cases, I don't think they're unreasonable. In Southern Europe and Northern Europe, I'm pretty sure for this purpose, France is in Southern Europe, but I'm not certain. It's always a question, and I can't remember. But basically what it shows is the crisis was the watershed. The crisis was clearly the watershed. And in the southern European countries, which were the ones that were most hit by the crisis, the Italians, the Greeks, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the support for populist parties exploded. Just as you'd expect, much less so in northern countries, which were also much less affected by the crisis. So my view is, as you said, we went bankrupt gradually, and then suddenly. I don't have a comparable data for the US and UK, and there's a difficulty in defining what's populist and non-populist, since these are two-party systems, so what happens is one of the parties gets taken over by the populists, but it's essentially the same thing. It's quite clear that the Republican Party of today, whatever you thought of the Republican Party of George W. Bush, is dramatically much more populist. And the same is true in a different direction of the Democrats. And I'll come to that distinction in a minute. I'm getting towards the end. So we've gone bankrupt politically. And when we go bankrupt politically, funny things happen. What I call the rise of zombie ideas. So I've just put one of my zombie ideas, which people in universities should worry about, thinking of, do we have support for universities? Well, we do have support for health research. We've agreed on that. Michael Gove, who went to Oxford, famously, who's now a member of our government, famously said in our referendum campaign, which was a populist uprising, if ever there was one, said people in this country have had enough of experts. By the way, of course, the experts he was despising were economists. And I wrote a paper which was published on an American website which said, well, it was quite reasonable because it's not clear we are experts. But anyway, this is an expression of one of the consequences across the West. We don't trust these people with these qualifications, which tell us that they're supposed to know what they're doing, because they don't. Why not listen to Donald Trump instead? He's probably not more stupid than those guys. That's really big. And they elected somebody who said what I show here. He said, quite contrary to Mr. Xi Jinping, 3 days later, we are not interested in that trade stuff, that market economy, global stuff. This is what I believe. And there was a big discussion at the time, by the way. Yeah, I'm all right, aren't I? There was a big discussion at the time whether we should take Trump seriously or literally, and supposedly his supporters took him seriously but not literally, and his opponents took him literally but not seriously. Well, I've always taken him seriously and literally. But anyway, the point is, whatever else, he's a serious protectionist, and he means it literally. And that's quite important, because that sort of blows up the world economy as we have it. And whether you want to have more self-sufficient economies or not, getting from here to there is going to be a very, very big mess. And we haven't started. And of course, Brexit is another exercise in deglobalization, by the way, and it sure is a big mess. So let me just think a bit, before I come to that, a little bit more about these zombie ideas. I've already talked about populism, and I want to be very precise about what I mean by it, because there's a lot of confusion, or at least inevitable confusion. So I think of this as two sorts of reformist, broadly speaking, reactions to the sort of mess we're seeing here. And I think reformist, radical reactions to the mess we've seen here are inevitable, just as they were in the 30s. But as we also saw in the 30s, some reactions were a good deal more helpful than others, and some of them were catastrophes. There's no doubt, for example, none in my view, I've done quite a bit of analysis of this, that Hitler would not have been elected without the Great Depression. I think it's important to distinguish destructive populism, often, but not always right-wing, from reformist radicalism, because they often use the same language. In fact, I have a wonderful quote in my book from FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the most important reformist, I think, in the 30s, which sounds exactly like a left-winger of the most extreme kind. The difference, I think, is not the language, even the demagogic style. It's a particular sort of view of the world, which Jens Werner Müller at Princeton defines as placing a virtuous people against irremediably corrupt elites, emphasizing the nation against cosmopolitan elites and racial minorities and immigrants, and rejecting the legitimacy of all constraining institutions, parliaments, courts, bureaucrats, free media, professors. And they do so for two reasons, which are central to their appeal. And you see it perfectly in the appeal of Donald Trump. All those institutions are staffed by elites and experts. So they represent the, quote unquote, deep state. This idea didn't come from nowhere. He's an opponent of the elite-dominated elite state institutions like courts, bureaucracies, experts. And these institutions are, as indeed they are, designed to thwart the will of the people as expressed on particular days, because that's part of what a properly functioning constitutional democracy is supposed to do. And instead, people trust a charismatic leader, and this then tends to lead to a vicious circle in which the failure of the populist leader to deliver to them what he has promised, it's always been he so far, but you in France might change that in the next election, which will be very interesting, at least for outsiders. So creates a vicious circle in which the failure of the populist project is attributed to elite treachery. Surely you recognize this. And this is incredibly dangerous because it short-circuits and eliminates fruitful, necessary reforms. And in my view, this is a personal view, while I have sympathy with some of the aims, indeed many of the aims, I think that our Labour government, Labour Party, if it became a government, on the other side, has equally incoherent ideas about how actually to change our society and economy for the better. The second really important zombie idea is that we can go back to fully fledged national sovereignty, which is a core idea, as I understand it, of Marine Le Pen. But you can correct me on that. I think the world economy has been brought together by technology. We impact one another on a radically increased scale. We cannot end this. We cannot decouple from one another. We need to provide global public goods, most obviously the protection of the environment, but also we need to maintain security and financial stability, and none of this can be done purely on a national scale. It's not possible to do this on the basis of national sovereignty. We have to create workable supranational regimes. So this call, which is another call that has come up for returning to pure national sovereignty, is also, in my view, while understandable, a zombie idea. And finally, we are seeing a number of zombie ideas in economics, of which the most important is the sort of protectionism we associate with Donald Trump. And I just thought I'd put this in to indicate what's going on here. This is an indication of just how profoundly he's destabilizing world trade, and we're only beginning. So this, I don't quite know why the colors look so peculiar, but basically I'm virtually at the end now. So basically this shows average tariffs across the world. In general, the high-income countries have lower average tariffs than the emerging countries, but they're all pretty low by now. And this was where the US was before Donald Trump came. And you can see in a couple of years, 2.5 years, he is well on the way to converting US trade policy to something like that of India. And it is very difficult to imagine that if that continues, and the destruction of the institutions of world trade that's associated with that, that others are not going to follow. I think it's very difficult to imagine. And then we are really in danger of a downward spiral in economic activity across the world. So let me just sort of leave you with, before I come to those conclusions, my basic story here is pretty simple. We have a complex interaction between economic and political systems. In the 40 years prior to the crisis, prior to today perhaps, we achieved some very remarkable things happened in a very large part of the developing world. We achieved not insignificant increases in prosperity, but some very big long-running problems emerged in the developed countries. This was followed by a gigantic financial crisis, which devastated economies and the credibility of elites. And this has finally destabilized our economies and our polities to a very, very significant degree. The challenge we have in front of us is to restore and re-establish working economies and polities. I think there are a whole host of things that need to be done. I'd be very happy to talk from my perspective about some of the things we can do in economics and the constraints that might arise. Some of them involve really profound changes in, for instance, the way the Eurozone works, in the way the world economy works, the way demand management works, the way the income distribution is managed. And some of them might well require quite significant changes in the way democracy works. But the essential point I'm trying to make in this lecture is the analysis of how we got here. And I think it's pretty clear to me that we have slowly gone bankrupt, and then it happened very quickly. That's where we are today, and we cannot assume that we're going to go back to business as usual. It's far more likely that we will remain in this very difficult, possibly profoundly transformative period, and we are doing this at precisely the moment when our countries, the high-income countries, weight in the world and power in the world is dramatically falling. And one of our number, the most important, the US, is reacting to that with increasingly virulent partisanship at home and an increasing desire to start a fundamental decoupling from and conflict with the rising superpower. So this is not just about what's happening to us internally, it affects the entire global order and its stability. And my hope is that you will recognize the urgency of this issue, and I hope too, since many of you are young and have the energy to do so, you will come up with the right, necessary, and successful solutions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for a very inspiring talk. Okay, it's open for questions. You would like here?
Thank you very much for your talk. I believe that one of the issues being addressed here is the problem of the nation state. You spoke to it at the beginning, but in the end, the nation state introduces a number of constraints. For example, I, as an American citizen who live in Germany and work in France, have diluted democratic power because I only vote in the federal elections in the US, and I do not vote at the local level. So the Eurozone does better. It allows its member citizens to vote at the local level elsewhere. But in other terms, it takes a whole generation for people who have emigrated to actually be able to vote. I believe that's an issue that would be interesting to consider. And the second point I would wish to make, and I think that you can address this, is that as a physicist, we understand that you have a conservation of all quantities in general, energy, for example, and it strikes me as peculiar that with 24 hours in a day and 2 hands, I can, in principle, be allowed to produce an unlimited amount of goods in the form of a salary. So the concept of a maximum salary is, to me, something that could be interesting to explore in order to reduce inequalities. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just the first one. Oh, they elect the nation state. Okay. I'd love to be a decent political philosopher. So in thinking about these issues, I've become increasingly interested in the confusions, which perhaps is unfair, the compromises we have probably inevitably made between different conceptions of the way we live and should live, or different aspects of the way we live and should live. So, as you rightly say, and as I stressed at the beginning, our starting point politically, the sort of the structure within which we think political life ought to work in the modern world, at least in our part of the modern world, is the state, which is defined as a nation of some kind. I've been thinking for a long time of whether Switzerland is a nation state. I can't make up my mind. Swiss people seem to be Swiss, but there's obviously many aspects in which they're not quite a nation. Anyway, the idea that these are people who share a culture with you, which share a sort of history with you, a sense of identity with you, which goes with your obligations to the state and the state's obligations to you, within which citizenship works and which works through political processes that allow you to choose, in theory, representatives who are accountable to you. That's a sort of political theory. And then obviously, and this is a well-known problem, the Athenians just had it, is people migrate. Because that's another, we believe in individual freedom. We believe people have a right to move. In fact, we believe it's very useful if people move and good. And we also believe, as I've indicated, that we should have economic exchange of all other sorts across the world. So these are not autonomous little billiard balls completely separated from the world. So we then have to decide what rules govern all of that stuff, these other things which make it permeable and so forth, which continue to be legitimate and workable. And I focus not really on the migration side, it's more on the economic side. Well, what happens if these economic exchanges, and this links with your point about salary limits, these economic exchanges start generating results for our polity, which we really don't like. It divides it apart. It tears it apart. Even though it does very good things in the world, it's made Chinese people much richer, which would seem quite a good thing. So there are many dilemmas. And one of them is the one you mentioned, which is how quickly does somebody who moves to your country become a citizen? What are the requirements for their becoming a citizen? Can they be citizens of several countries? Many people have countries have different views on that. What political rights should they continue to have in the country they don't live in, but of which they're still a citizen? One of the big issues in our referendum on Brexit was whether people, it should have been an issue, but it never was actually, was whether people who live in other countries, particularly in Europe, should be allowed to vote in the referendum. As a matter of fact, they were all disenfranchised. So I think a whole slew of questions arise about how you handle politics, which assumes this citizenship location territory thing around a territorially contiguous state. I think all our states are now territorially contiguous since Pakistan broke apart. And we have all these people moving.
The US isn't.
Oh, yes, you're right. Two very important little bits of the US are, but most of them are. And so the result, and these are all very complicated compromises. And there isn't an answer. But you raise a pretty profound issue. Anyway, this is a core issue in thinking about the sorts of problems we've got here. On the second one, there is a discussion of salary caps. I'm not clear about whether anyone has actually legislated them, except the bonus caps in the finance, which were legislated by the EU, one of the things the city hates, which is why many of them supported Brexit. But I tend to think, question, I mean, what really worries me more than the absolute level, though it's important, is the thing that actually has driven the biggest inequality, which is the structure, which is really quite wonkish, the structure of bonuses. And particularly, if you look at the incentive structure of bonuses, which are the main reason American CEOs get, which share-linked, stock-linked pay, get these unbelievable salaries, it's pretty clear that they generate extremely perverse behavior in corporate management, and I just make them illegal. But certainly the question of why corporate governance, I haven't stressed this, how it works, how incentives work in corporations, why they are allowed to do this tax avoidance and all the rest of it, is one very important set of questions we're going to have to deal with. And tax raising is, that's why I raise it, one of the very biggest issues.
Yes, go ahead. Somebody else?
So yeah, about tax avoidance, I was surprised to see in the graph you showed this massive increase around 2005. Do you think that had any relationship with the financial crisis, which was just a few years later?
I think it was, oh dear, I've just destroyed it. It starts in 2000 and shoots up to, so by 2008, right, it's already very high. So it's clearly pre-crisis. I don't know exactly what happened, but something must have happened in US law, I can't see any other trigger, that allowed this massive profit shifting to emerge. But over that period, it is also the case, since the most important tax havens in the world are in Europe, namely Ireland and the Netherlands, in terms of scale, that they started becoming increasingly attractive, and it was before the EU began to do just a little bit to control them. But I don't understand fully why it exploded at precisely this time, but it clearly predates the crisis, and it has reached, I mean, I must say, I found this chart when I first saw it impossible to believe, but I've did it. I did check with my Brad. Nobody has questioned it. So that's clearly where we are. But there are some questions I can't answer.
And in terms of the absolute amount of money that's been, the absolute amount of money that's been diverted, if you wish, from going back to the local economies, you know.
So it's a percent of US GDP. So 1.5. So US GDP is about 20 trillion. So 1.5 would be the profits that they're attributing to these tiny countries must be about 300 billion a year. And now, so in terms of revenue, lost revenue, if you had the corporate profits tax they had before, that's probably about 100 billion a year in revenue. Now, it's not. That's actually quite a significant part of American federal revenue, which is less than 20% of GDP. So I wouldn't say it's the biggest thing. There are much bigger things going on, but it's not insignificant either. So that's roughly the magnitudes.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm a PhD student from Hong Kong in Strasbourg. I'm also your long-term readers of your columns in Financial Times. It's for me, it's a rare chance for me to direct asking you a question, because I just came across this seminar because of you, so I came here. But just very, I just want to ask you one question, just very regarding on the China and the US trade war, but for the time being, and now because our Hong Kong situation is very critical for the time being, and also the universities have been besieging by the police force. And it's now in the Hong Kong Polytechnic University, most of the students they are trapped in their campus. They cannot go out. But anyway, I think it's too far away. Just regarding for the U.S. Parliament, Senate, and Congress, they just passing the bill, Hong Kong Democracy and Human Rights Act. Now it is up to the President Donald Trump. Will he adopt this bill or not? It's very uncertain because he is now keeping silence on this matter. So I just want to.
What's the question?
Yeah, your question is that will Donald Trump be going to sign this bill or not? What do you think?
Well, one of the things I have, my general view about Mr. Trump is, one, I can't predict him. And I think I can't predict him because I don't think he can predict him. He does do surprising things in both directions. So, for instance, he did persuade me at one point he was going to start a war with North Korea, and then a few months later decided Kim Jong-un was the nicest person in the whole world and the only person he really loved. So, unbelievable. So, predicting him is impossible. I think in this question there will be three considerations in his mind. The first is, does this really matter to me one way or the other? Do I want the fight on this? He obviously doesn't care about democracy. That's obvious. But that was the first question he will ask. The second question is, if I veto this, I'm going to make even more enemies in the Hill, and given what's going on in the House right now, maybe that wouldn't be a terribly good idea. That's a rational consideration, and how rational he is, God knows. But there's a third consideration, which with him is very difficult to predict, but I think it's sort of obvious, which is he has decided that right now, at least before the next election, he wants to cool this war with China. He wants to cool it. He doesn't want to eliminate it, but he wants a short-term agreement, which he can say is the greatest trade agreement in the history of the world and allows him a platform for his re-election. That's obvious. And signing this thing, he's going to piss off Xi massively, it seems to me. So he will consider, or likely to, so he will consider that rather undesirable. So my guess is, which is worth nothing in this case, but it's free, is he will veto it. But he might surprise me. He has before. He is not the most predictable of human beings, which everybody will agree on, including his staff.
Any other questions? Yes, Amari.
The system is very unstable. Can you see a way to stabilize it? For instance, Mario Draghi and the Central European Bank saved the euros in some ways, sort of. Well, you don't seem to agree, but that's what one reads. So can you see a stabilizing system? It has been talked about just after the crisis, but nothing happened much.
That's a very, very good question. And it's the core question I'm trying to tackle in the last 2 chapters of my book, which I'm about to write. So any contributions will be held. Everything I've written is about an incredible mess we're in. And now, so I think, so I'll make the following comments. The first comment is, after the Second World War, I discussed that in another lecture I gave at the OECD yesterday, the Western world, broadly defined, in the succeeding 10, 20 years, did a staggering job, given what most people expected in 45 or in 47, in stabilizing the system. And they did so by creating a unique and largely unexpected, but amazingly successful balance between the political and economic systems. The political system was resolved around internationally cooperating, and here we just mean the West, because nobody else was there, the Cold War and so forth, around internationally cooperative, essentially social democratic states with high levels of public spending, high levels of intervention, commitments to full employment, but also liberalizing and opening, along with the American security umbrella, pretty obviously at that time, and very crucially, the beginning of the EEC, the European Economic Community. So it took domestic politics and international politics combined with economics and security in what turned out to be a remarkably successful system. And there were intellectual progenitors of this. You all know who they were. Monnet, Keynes, crucially, even Harry Dexter White, and of course FDR and Truman and their administrations, the German social market economists, Erhard, all of these played a crucial role. But what's so important about it is how much they did in how short a time. And they did so because they were coming out of ruin. So it's been done. It's much more difficult now because we're in a global community. We have to deal with China, obviously. And we have old systems which have dissolved their legitimacy, but we haven't had a complete breakdown, thank heavens. There is another view, by the way, not a majority view, but there is another view out there, which is if only we'd let the financial crisis really take its course, we would have had a monstrous political and economic crisis. The Eurozone would have gone. The EU would not be the one you know. We would have had a true Great Depression, and this would all have been very, very helpful for reconstruction. I think this is insane, but there are people who think that way. It is certainly true that really radical reform is much easier after total breakdown, but so is World War III, so I don't go there. But given that we haven't had a total breakdown, in fact, we've done a remarkable job of papering everything together, and while we got an immense number of angry people, they haven't yet taken over any country except America, and it's a big exception, and to some degree Britain, which still matter a bit, and America matters a lot, but in Europe it's still the center is sort of held. The result is what seems to me to have happened, and that's my second major point, is a crisis of political will. Everybody's like a deer in front of the headlights, and they can't agree on doing anything, which is why, in the end, amazingly and completely, in my view, illegitimately, but thank heavens for it, they had to rely on the ECB, an unelected institution not created to solve these sorts of crises, did what it could, which was not enough, by the way. It didn't solve the crisis, it just solved the immediate crisis. I can easily give you scenarios in which you get new ones, which will be much more difficult to handle. So you've got a paralysis of politics, and you've certainly got a paralysis of leadership, because in my view, there is basically no Western politician who has a coherent view of where to go and any capacity to implement it. I mean, the least incoherent, by far, is the President of France, and his capacity to change any of this is very small, obviously. So the situation we're in is very depressing if you want things to happen. So that's my third point, is the best we can realistically hope for is that we muddle through successfully. And the next 10 years will look like the last 10 years, which is, I think, the most likely outcome, by the way. That 10 years from now we'll still be moaning about this. I hope that's not the case, because I think the alternative to that is a real breakdown somewhere. Something massive happens. I can think of quite a number of candidates for that, and we don't manage to manage it. But is that my third point? Fourth, final. Of course we could do much better. I think we're pretty clear, and I've written a lot about this, how to do demand management better, which is a crucial element in what we have to do. It's pretty clear that we need pretty radical reform of some of the issues we've called, the tax system, corporate governance, very, very important, the way the financial sector works, but above all, the role of the state in terms of investment and support for private investment. It's clearly clear where you'd want to go, though we can have lots of arguments around how exactly it would do. It's clear this won't well if we don't do it together, particularly in Europe. And that means in the EU's context, Germany has to move quite a lot. And I think it's reasonably clear, at least in some cases, that we need some fairly serious thought about whether our politics are adequately representative. And I have some ideas, but they're really wild, which I will put to one side. So I am very concerned that we are in stasis, that we're locked in doing nothing, except when we do really stupid things like elect Donald Trump. This is not an improvement, or do Brexit. So that's where all the energy is on the populist side. There's no energy in the centre. I think it could lead to more of this stasis, but in the end, I don't think that will be successful, and we probably just postponed a more serious crisis. At this stage, therefore, it is very, very important that we develop alternative ideas on what to do. And that's one of the things that did happen in the 30s. There was a tremendous intellectual ferment in the 30s about how to run the system better. And one of the things that has depressed me most, and it's perhaps partly my fault, very last thought, is the economics profession, to take the one I know best, has done remarkably little soul-searching about the past, about its mistakes, and thinking about what a better future might look like. And the contrast between what has happened now in the 30s is, from this point of view, I think very depressing.
Thank you very much. So we'll stop with this wonderful prospect.